A camera is rolling on a rocky, uneven ridge. Through the lens, a massive gray cloud is violently rushing down the mountain. It is moving at over 100 miles per hour, superheated to 1,000 degrees. The two people holding the camera do not turn and run. They just watch the ash fill the viewfinder. The footage survives the extreme heat, but the people holding the camera do not. Mount Unzen sits on the southern island of Kyushu. For nearly 200 years, the massive peak had been completely silent. It looked like a sleeping giant, heavily covered in thick green forest. But in the spring of 1991, the earth began to aggressively wake up. Magma pushed violently toward the surface, shattering the bedrock. The movement triggered thousands of small, localized earthquakes. Thick plumes of heavy gray ash started blackening the sky above the nearby city of Shimabara. Most people looked at the mountain with absolute dread. They packed their cars and drove as far away as possible. But the Katia and Maurice Krafft went against every natural human instinct. They booked the very first flight they could find and headed straight for the mountain. The Kraffts were French volcanologists, but they operated more like storm chasers. They were completely obsessed with standing as close to erupting Earth as physically possible. For 20 years, they traveled the globe documenting geological violence. They filmed rivers of glowing lava in Hawaii and exploding craters in Iceland. They stood inches away from boiling rock, wearing silver heat suits to protect their skin. Their footage was absolutely breathtaking. Their reputation in the scientific community was entirely unmatched, but volcanologists divide mountains into two incredibly distinct categories. There are red volcanoes, which ooze slow, predictable rivers of molten rock. You can easily outwalk a red lava flow. Then there are gray volcanoes. Gray volcanoes do not bleed lava. They build immense internal pressure until they violently explode. They completely destroy everything around them in a matter of seconds. Katia and Maurice Krafft knew exactly how dangerous these gray mountains were. They had witnessed the absolute devastation they leave behind. Maurice famously told a journalist that he knew the ash would eventually kill him. He accepted the risk without hesitation. He claimed capturing the footage was worth the ultimate price. Mount Unzen was a gray volcano, and the Kraffts were marching directly toward its summit. By early June, the Japanese government ordered a massive civilian evacuation. Tens of thousands of residents fled Shimabara, abandoning their homes. Police set up strict barricades to prevent anyone from driving up the mountain roads. The danger was mathematically certain. But the global press completely ignored the warnings. Dozens of journalists, photographers, and thrill seekers bypassed the police line. They hiked up the mountain slopes to get a bare view of the growing ash dome. They wanted the perfect photograph for the front page. Katia and Maurice joined them, bringing their heavy film equipment deep into the red zone. They set up their cameras on an elevated ridge known as Kita Kamikoba. It was positioned roughly 2 miles away from the ridge, sat directly above the steep Mizunashi River valley. They firmly believed it was the perfect tactical location. If the volcano violently erupted, the heavy flow of ash and rock would naturally follow the deep riverbed right below them. Gravity would pull the danger down into the trench. They would be safely out of the path of destruction on the high ground. But the mountain was actively changing its own geography. High above them, a massive dome of hardened lava was clinging to the crater. It was rapidly cracking under the immense pressure from the magma below. The structural integrity of the rock was entirely compromised. It was a dam waiting to burst. On the afternoon of June 3rd, the mountain a massive chunk of the lava dome violently collapsed. Gravity pulled thousands of tons of superheated rock directly down the. But it wasn't just falling rock. The collapse triggered a catastrophic pyroclastic flow. This is the most lethal geological event on the entire planet. It is a dense, ground-hugging avalanche of toxic gas, ash, and jagged stone. The temperature inside the cloud easily exceeds 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It destroys absolutely everything it touches in the fraction of a second, and it moves at over 100 miles per hour. You cannot drive away from it. You cannot outrun it on foot. Once it starts falling, the The massive gray cloud cascaded down the mountain, heading straight for Izunashi. Down on the ridge, the journalists pointed their long lenses the incoming destruction. They thought they were capturing a masterpiece. Katia and Maurice stood their ground, looking directly through their viewfinder. They expected the lethal flow to stay confined to the deep river gorge below, but then everything shifted. The avalanche of rock hit a sharp bend in the valley. The sheer momentum of the heavy debris acted exactly like a ramp. The superheated gas separated from the falling rock. It violently jumped the ridge. The cloud wasn't following the river anymore. It was rushing directly up the hillside toward the cameras. Cases like this prove that nature does not negotiate with human calculations, and if witnessing the unforgiving reality of the wild is why you watch, subscribe to Evidence Zero, because the final footage captured that day changes how you see the world completely. Through the lens of Maurice's camera, the sky simply disappears. The gray wall expands violently, entirely filling the frame. In the final seconds of the video, you can see the absolute realization of the journalists. The people around the Krafts suddenly drop their expensive equipment. They turn in the dirt, frantically scrambling to run toward the thin tree line. Panic completely shatters their false sense of security. But Katia and Maurice do not run. They were seasoned experts who had studied these clouds their entire lives. They knew exactly how fast the superheated gas was moving. They knew that turning their backs would not buy them a single extra second of life. They simply stayed next to it. The camera continued to roll as the gray wall consumed the ridge entirely. The footage snaps to absolute darkness. The audio cuts to the deafening roar of the burning wind. And then, the plastic components of the camera melted completely to the boiling. The pyroclastic flow washed over the Kitakami-Koba ridge and burned everything in its path. 43 people were instantly killed in the massive blast. Journalists, local taxi drivers, and a group of volunteer firefighters were completely vaporized in the ash. The heat was so intense that it instantly boiled the water inside the human body. When the cloud finally settled, the landscape was completely unrecognizable. The lush green mountain ridge had been reduced to a charred gray wasteland. It looked exactly like the surface of the moon. Rescue teams in heavy protective gear moved into the disaster zone days later. The ash on the ground was still physically hot to the touch. They found the bodies of the journalists scattered near the tree line. They had died running, struck down from behind by the 1,000-degree wind. The heat had melted their boots directly into the rock. But searchers found Katia and Maurice exactly where they had planted their camera. They were lying close to each other in the thick gray dust. They had faced the mountain until the absolute very end. Nearby, recovery teams found Maurice's heavy metal camera housing. The extreme heat had severely damaged the exterior equipment, but the internal film was miraculously preserved deep inside the casing. When investigators eventually developed the footage, they witnessed the sheer, terrifying power of the mountain. The final frame is just a chaotic blur of gray death accelerating toward the lens. It is a deeply haunting piece of physical evidence. But the tragic death of Katia and Maurice was not the end of their story. Just a few weeks later, halfway across the world, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines began to violently rumble. It was a massive gray volcano, significantly larger and more dangerous than Unzen. Local officials were struggling to convince the surrounding population to evacuate. People didn't understand the invisible danger of pyroclastic flows. They thought they could just hide inside their wooden houses and wait out the falling ash. They were drastically underestimating the violence of the earth. So geologists brought a videotape to the local government leaders. They played the final footage captured by Katia and Maurice Krafft. They showed the authorities exactly what a pyroclastic flow looks like when it breaks containment. They showed them the speed, the raw violence, and the absolute finality of the cloud. The footage completely shattered their hesitation. The Philippine government immediately ordered one of the largest civilian evacuations in human history. Tens of thousands of people were moved out of the danger zone just days before the mountain completely exploded. Mount Pinatubo erupted with terrifying force, burying entire towns in deep, boiling ash. It was the second largest volcanic eruption in the entire 20th century. If the population had stayed in their homes, the death toll would have been catastrophic. The footage Katia and Maurice died to capture directly saved thousands of innocent lives. Their entire existence was dedicated to understanding the fury of the earth. They chased the fire because they believed seeing the danger was the only way to survive it. The visual evidence they left behind proved they were absolutely right. Today, the final footage from Mount Unzen is still studied by geologists all over the world. It serves as a stark, permanent reminder of human fragility. You can calculate the trajectory of the rocks. You can measure the distance to the crater. You can stand on the high ground and trust the valley below. But a mountain can change its mind in an absolute fraction of a second. And when the earth decides to move, there is absolutely nowhere to hide. The ash simply buries everything. They pulled the heavy camera from the scorched earth. They watched the gray cloud fill the final frame. But the people looking through the lens were already gone.